Okay, well, we've started to get a quorum here. Uh,
Cool.
so today, what we're going to do is a couple of closing remarks on the existentialist, and then we're going to move it into the 20th century, which I actually have never done before in a class, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But before we get to that, I wanted to cover a couple of things we didn't finish with on the existentialist. One is uh, Nietzsche's concept of amor fati or the eternal return. Those are similar doctrines, or I don't know, doctrines isn't right with Nietzsche, but they are points of view or points he makes. And amor fati is the love of fate. Now, uh, and the reason it has something to do with the eternal recurrence is that Nietzsche thinks that any kind of resentment is weakness. And the reason it's weakness is because if you resent things, it's because you think that they were imposed upon you. They weren't your choice. And Nietzsche would like to emphasize that nothing is not your choice. Everything is your choice. And so if you resent things, it's because you think somebody has gotten the better of you, or some circumstance has gotten the better of you and taken advantage of you, and you're mad about it. And so you resent it. And this is a lot of the reason, in Nietzsche's view, for Christianity or other religions too. And that is the resentment, there's a payoff to it, there's a solution to the resentment, and that is Judgment Day, when those people that mistreated you will get their comeuppance, and you'll feel victorious, or somehow your sufferings will be redeemed on Judgment Day. Everything will be fair. And Nietzsche thinks this is nonsense. That when you resent things, it's a sign of your own weakness and inability to structure your own life. And the eternal recurrence is has to do with that, because Nietzsche says the eternal recurrence is, imagine that what you're doing right now, you have to do again and again for eternity. And the point of this exercise is to is that a person who is resentful will say no, no matter what their circumstance. They'll say, no, this is terrible. I'm experiencing something terrible. I never want to be here again. Whereas Nietzsche says the person who has freed himself from resentment will say, fine, I'm fine with any moment of my life. I'm fine with it. It's just as good as every other moment of my life. And so an eternal recurrence for the Nietzschean is not a horror, but for somebody who's resentful and weak, it's like hell. It would be like living in hell to have to live this moment over and over again. So that's the kind of distinction he makes. And uh, I kind of like it. And I've made perhaps an illegitimate leap here in comparing it to Christian faith and other kinds of faith, and also Buddhist acceptance, because uh, Christian faith can be seen as, and has been with in some theologians, as a state of mind rather than faith that something's going to happen, or faith that something is true. Faith that there is a God, for example, or faith that everything will work out, or faith that God has a plan. It doesn't have to be that. It could just be simply a state of mind. Faith can be a state of mind. And I think that's what Nietzsche is saying with amor fati and the eternal return. Now, of course, Nietzsche is an atheist, and a Christian is not an atheist, obviously, but the idea is that both of these themes, I think, suggest a state of mind that feels um, uh, unperturbed. And what's the old gospel song? Standing by the everlasting love. Oh, anyway, I can't think of the actual the finishing of that phrase, but it's a gospel, it's a state of mind rather than being faith in something being true or faith that something will happen. You can visualize it, and I think Kierkegaard does, as a state of insupportable, rationally insupportable good feeling. And remember, he felt that he never arrived at that state. So, yeah, Peter.
I think the hymn you want is Safe in the Everlasting Arms.
Well, yeah, saving the everlasting arms, but
Yeah.
safe and
There's another.
secure from
I just put it in
say I know what the line I'm looking for is safe and secure from all alarm.
arms.
Yeah.
Neat.
It rhymes with the line you just said. Safe and secure from all alarm,
Yeah.
not just
Uh,
safe and secure, but safe and secure from even being alarmed.
yeah.
So I think that's the state that Nietzsche is describing with the eternal return with amor fati, which again is love of fate. And I think it can be parallel to Christian faith in some interpretations. Some people like to say that faith, well, most people I think probably like to say that faith is faith that something will happen, or faith that God exists or something like that. But there are Christian theologians who put it in a different way, which is more like a state of mind. Yeah, Peter.
I think a term that works even better for a parallel between Nietzsche and Christianity is redemption. There's a section in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of redemption. Uh, and at some point, he says, uh, "Oh, my friend, have you ever said yes to one joy? Oh, my friend, then you said yes to all woe as well. All things are chained and entwined together. All things are in love." That's different from Christianity, but you end up almost at a very similar point.
Well, I kind of like to say that they're all so vague that they can be true to
Yes,
uh
that's true. That is
that
true.
if they mean something to you, fine, but I and we're going to get to that very point in a minute, but I think there
I
may be a
agree with you.
parallel. I'm pretty sure Nietzsche would be horrified to have himself compared to a Christian, a faithful Christian, but uh nevertheless, that's what I'm doing. So sue me. Uh all right, so I don't have a lot more to say about existentialism. We're going to leave the 19th century behind now and start with the 20th century. And the 20th century, in a lot of ways, can be seen. Okay, well, there's an extension of the 19th century in guys like Sartre and Heidegger, Husserl. These guys kind of extended or continued the tradition started by Hegel and then expressed by Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, but then Heidegger brings some more Hegelian, comprehensible prose back to the playing field. And whereas Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are pretty easy to read, they're not like that. The concluding unscientific postscript by Kierkegaard is a bit thick. But most of them are parables like you'd hear in Sunday school, and they're very perceptive. Kierkegaard's a very perceptive writer, especially when it comes to logic of some kind of thing. Oh, Bill, I see you have your wrist bandage. Are you recovering?
Yeah, everything's good.
All right, good. Anyway, so, but we're not going to talk about Heidegger and Sartre. Enough about the 19th century kind of grandiose ideas of philosophy. We're going to turn to the British linguistic analysts, and that'll be Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's not British himself, but he is associated with these guys. And then the Vienna Circle, and then the early and later Wittgenstein. That's what we're going to concentrate on. Wittgenstein was the most prominent of all these guys, and in a way, you can see the Vienna Circle as reaction to Wittgenstein, and also the later linguistic analysts as influenced by Wittgenstein. he was a dominant figure in that kind of way of thinking. So a lot of times you call the Heideggerians and Sartreans and so forth the continental philosophers of the 20th century, whereas the analytic philosophers are associated with Vienna. Not that that's not continental, but also with Britain. And so it was a reaction against the grandiose thinking of that was so central to Hegel and Nietzsche and Marx and Kierkegaard. They had these grand visions, and I've often called them romantic visions. And the reason I call them that is maybe it's not fair, but is because the grand visions appeal to your emotions and your sense of real grandiose truths, big truths. Uh, and what happened was a bunch of guys, maybe G.E. Moore was the first guy from England, and he said stuff like this, Um, he's talking about Descartes, and he says, "Now I'm going to hold up my hand. What's more likely, that I'm holding up my hand or that some evil genius has taken control of my brain and is making me think I'm holding up my hand? What seems more sensible and likely to you?" This is the kind of way that G.E. Moore talks. And so it's some people call it common sense philosophy. Now, when philosophy turned in this direction as a response to continental, grandiose continental ideas, there are a lot of people that, hey, they were appalled. They said they're not doing philosophy anymore. Uh, we want this big stuff. We don't want some kind of little picayune, little detailed things. But I could argue that this just goes back to the same thing Socrates said. It was the same thing he was doing, just analyzing, trying to get clear on what you're saying. And through uh, Aristotle and what there was an idea, and it probably starts with Plato, but certainly amplified by Aristotle, and then more amplified by guys like Hume. There was an idea that if we could just get clear with our language, and this is the origin of Aristotle developing logic. So if we could just get clear with our language, we could understand better what's going on, what the ultimate truth is, and not be vague about things. And that really starts, I think it's fair to say it starts with Socrates, not and it doesn't start with Hegel. But I'm gonna I'm gonna read a passage from Hegel that gives you an idea of what these guys were rebelling against. Let me see if I can find this here. Because um, do, not I should have myself more organized, but okay. Uh, this is an example of Hegel. This is from Science of Logic. And this is, again, what I'm giving you as an example of things they were rebelling against. Okay, this is a quote from Hegel. Being, pure being, without further determination, in its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself. It is also not unequal in relation to another. It has no diversity within itself, nor any with a reference outward. By virtue of its indeterminate immediacy, it is not capable of being distinguished from anything else or from itself. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing to be intuited in it. If one can speak here of intuiting, that is, or it is only this pure, empty intuition itself. Insofar as we can talk of anything here, of thinking here, sorry, this is to be taken as the empty thinking of itself. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, and neither more or less than nothing. So,
Well,
anybody
that's
want to
obvious.
anybody want to parse that for me? Kind of maybe simplify it so I can understand it. So this is the kind of this is legitimate philosophy. That's Hegel talking. That's not some madman. And you heard what maybe you don't remember what Schopenhauer said about this kind of thing. Schopenhauer just thought it was nonsense and insane. Um, but this was the 19th century, and this kind of talk was even inherited by Marx, and we think of Marx as being, a hardcore kind of realist and somebody who's interested in social issues. But Marx has passages like this too. I could find one for you, uh, and because he's coming from this tradition, and this is what the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle, and Wittgenstein are rebelling against. And rebelling may be too strong a word. What they're trying to do is say, wait a minute, what? I just don't understand anything you've said. And so let me give you some examples that the Vienna Circle guys give the logical positivists give for statements you can find in philosophy that they don't think make any sense. Uh, and I just have a list of them here. The absolute is beyond time and space. Being is more real than existence. God exists outside of time. The world is an illusion. The soul is immortal. Nothingness is prior to being. This is a kind of thing that they said, well, can we define these terms a little bit so we can get clear on what's being said, please? Uh, and so this led to some strange things, though, however. And I'm going to read because some of the stuff that the logical positives say is just seems just as nutty as that. And I'm going to read something by Wittgenstein for you that I think you'll find just as nutty as what Hegel said. Um, Here's a passage from the Philosophical Investigations, which is his second work. I'll orient you a little bit more in a minute about what this is, but this is one of his later works. Okay, here he goes. When I say my broom is in the corner, is this really a statement about the broomstick and the brush? Well, it could, at any rate, be replaced by a statement giving the position of the stick and the position of the brush. And this statement is surely further analyzed for a further analyzed form of the first one. But why do I call it further analyzed? Well, if the broom is there, that surely means that the stick and brush must be there, and in particular relation to one another. And this was, as it were, hidden in the sense of the first sentence, as expressed and analyzed in the second sentence. Then does someone who says that the broom is in the corner really mean the broomstick is there and so is the brush, and the broomstick is fixed in the brush? If we were to ask someone, if he meant this, he would probably say that he had not thought specifically of the broomstick or especially of the brush at all. And that would be the right answer, for he meant to speak neither of the stick nor the brush in particular. All right. So, have things been clarified for you? Uh, yeah, Peter. Uh, Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There.
Okay. I would say it's clear, but it's also banal. Obviously, when you refer to the broom, you're not specifically differentiating between stick and brush unless you have some reason to. So I can follow it much better than I can follow the Hegel statement. My reaction is kind of, so what?
Okay, that's exactly right. So and it was exactly the response I had when I first started reading these guys, and it was the response of this is back. My first introduction of Wittgenstein was back in Pomona, and everybody in the class felt exactly what you just said. That so, I mean, big deal. I'm not going to spend my time talking about stuff like that when I could be talking about Marx or Hegel or something important, right? Uh, However, Um, it's my job. Okay, so the reason I think I mentioned this, the reason I never teach this, there are two reasons. One is the first reason is trying to convince anybody that anything these guys say is of any value whatsoever. Because the first reaction is always pretty much what you said, that no, this is not philosophy. This is not something anything this is not anything substantial. That's one danger in going into the 20th century. The second danger is that once you understand what Wittgenstein says in the philosophical investigations, you think it resolves everything. That's the other danger. So it's kind of the alpha and omega. The worst, the first thing is it doesn't mean anything at all. And the second reaction after you get used to what he's saying is that, oh, well, this resolves everything. So it's like a mirror image of the two problems. And I have little faith that I'm going to be able to guide you through this so that, first of all, you think it means something. And second of all, you know it doesn't mean everything. That's my job. And I'm not confident I can accomplish it by any means. Okay, so I'm going to mainly concentrate on Wittgenstein. Okay, Wittgenstein was a guy who was very wealthy, gave away all his money, and he went to school and studied some philosophy and I think engineering. And then he went to World War One. He was I think maybe an ambulance driver. I'm not really sure what he did in World War One, but while he was in the trenches, supposedly, he thought he was having these thoughts. And he came up with the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which is his first major work. And he present he didn't go through the PhD program. He just presented it as his PhD thesis, and it was accepted. And Russell was his main uh, cheerleader. Russell thought this guy has something going on. Bertrand Russell, that is, the famous kind of lovable British philosopher. And Russell saw immediately this guy is very smart and we have to listen, we have to pay attention. So they gave him a PhD and he spent some time teaching and then he quit teaching. And I think the two things, he had a very hermetic life, I think. And one of the things he did was teach elementary school, and another thing he did was become a gardener. And all the time he's making these notes and thinking about things. Now, there was never anything else published in his lifetime other than the Tractatus. But after he died, I think I mentioned Elizabeth Anscombe earlier. Elizabeth Anscombe was one of his main translators and interpreters. And she's the one that said the existentialists are wet behind the ears. Uh, People like her went through all of his papers and basically published everything, even stuff that this is kind of like what happened to Aristotle. Uh, the editors of Aristotle didn't, and for all we know, consult with him ever. They just put his papers together after he died, and that's what we have of Aristotle right now. His papers that were intended to be published, we have been lost. We don't know, and so Wittgenstein very well may have written a bunch of stuff in the philosoph that got published as the Blue and Brown books and the Philosophical Investigations, a bunch of other stuff, all of which I've read. We can't be certain that he ever intended to publish any of this stuff, and probably the Philosophical Investigations most likely, but the Blue and Brown books were just notes, and uh, there may be remarks in there that he'd rather not be in there. That's the kind of situation we're with Wittgenstein. But yet the things we do have are so insightful and so original that you can't ignore them. So that's the situation with his career. As far as the rest of philosophy is concerned, well, what happened was he wrote the Tractatus, and all the guys in the Vienna Circle said, "Oh my God, this is the business." And they really oriented their thinking around the Tractatus. And I'll get in a moment to what the main themes of the Tractatus were. And then this is how they built their careers basically on these kinds of assumptions. And then little did they know that in the meantime, Wittgenstein, being a elementary school teacher and a gardener, is completely rewriting it and undermining everything he said. Not exactly undermining, it's that's too strong of a word, but minimizing a lot of things he said. And so these guys have built their careers thinking, oh yeah, this is the way to go. And then this guy comes out and says, no, that's not really it. And his remarks in the philosophical investigations became kind of the foundation for what happened in British linguistic analysis and common sense language, or that kind of British stuff. And that became kind of predominant after the 50s in Britain and the US. Although, there were still guys teaching uh, Heidegger in the US too, and Kant and so forth. I took a Wittgenstein class from oh geez, I'll think of his name in a minute. He was a Pomona professor that became a professor at the Yale Graduate School, and I took a graduate class in Wittgenstein from him. He was Fogler. He was very good. He was excellent. But I took another class. It was interesting. It was one class on Wittgenstein and Heidegger, where the professor was examining the arguments of both and trying to make sense of both of them in relationship to one another. You remember when I said a long time ago that what you do in philosophy is you go through all these guys and then you start looking through all of them through the eyes of all the rest of them. It's very incestuous. So anyway, let me go through the some of the main points of the Tractatus, and it's usually referred to as the Tractatus, by the way. All right. Um, this is a very formal kind of presentation. Everything's numbered, and it's really meant to put an end to philosophy. He thinks that he's done it. And so let's start out. He says the world is everything that is the case. The world's not a collection of things, but of facts, of actual states of affairs. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. That's a quote. So, what does that mean? Uh, Actually, maybe go to the final, most famous statement of the Tractatus which is at the end. He says, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This is almost like seems like it came out of the Tao Te Ching. And everybody recognizes he has a mystical side to him. So he's not this dry, uh, kind of mathematical philosopher. He is that, but he has a mystical side, and he certainly recognizes. Remember, I said he's a big uh, fan of Kierkegaard, who's not exactly a logical positivist. So the world is everything that is the case. What he means is, insofar as we can say anything that's true, and this again goes back to Socrates. That's a funny thing. It goes back to Socrates saying that the one thing he's sure he believes is that there's a difference between truth and opinion, and we want to know where that line is between truth and opinion. That's what Wittgenstein is saying here, really. He's saying the world is everything that is the case means that anything that we can say as a fact about the world is something that is a proposition that we can say that is the case. If we can't say that, then yeah, it's things we can't talk about essentially. You can talk about them and they're not unimportant, but they can't be said to be the actual representation of the real world. one way of looking at what he does in the Tractatus is again, he's like I said at the beginning, he feels like if we could just simplify language, we could know what the truth is. We could just pare it down to the things we really know and get rid of the superfluous things that aren't really important or can't be substantiated, right? So what he imagines he's constructing it's called the picture theory of the world, that language is kind of you could think of it as a grid and where atomic facts, which is not his term, but that's what the logical positivist said. You have atomic facts like gold, I guess. One of the problems with Wittgenstein that was discovered not too long is it's very difficult to define within the rules he sets out what an atomic fact is. That's like a internal problem. But anyway, the idea is that you have a very specific fact, like I don't know, Washington, D.C., and then you connect it to other facts using what are called uh, well-formed formulas. In other words, perfect grammar and perfect logic. And you connect these logic facts in a grid together with one another. And in the end, if you do this diligently enough and strictly enough, you'll come up with a picture of the world that is everything that is the case, which is what he said, everything that is the case. So then, outside of that, there may be plenty of important things. In fact, I think I have a quote to that effect. He says, um, anything beyond the world of facts, including ethics, God, the meaning of life, is unsayable. These things are shown, not saying, and not stated. They're important, but they're not expressible in propositional language. That's the idea that yes, they might have a motive value. They might have kind of a a value in mood or emotion, but they can't be said to be the fact. They can't be said to be the case. So he's trying to limit. Uh, Remember, Kant said he's limiting reason to make room for faith, and that's not the same that Wittgenstein is doing. I don't want to kludge those two guys together, but it comes from the same impetus to try to, okay, what could we be clear on? And then beyond that, we better acknowledge that we're not clear on it, that we don't know. All right. So uh, going on with some more uh, kind of the standard interpretations of the Tractatus. Um, a logical picture of facts is a thought. So thoughts are pictures of reality. They share the same logical form as what they represent. So that's the picture theory of truth or reality, is that they our understanding of reality is kind of limited by the same logical form as our language that describes them. And propositions have truth functions, and we know these truth tables. If you've had a logic class, we figure out the truth or falsehood of a statement using truth tables. And then what we have is complex propositions are made from elementary propositions using strict logical connections. And all meaningful large propositions can be generated from elementary propositions, which connects atomic facts in a logical way. And then the idea is logic is transcendental. I don't think he uses the word transcendental. Uh, what he means is that our language is above, it's a picture of the world that floats above the world, as it were. Um, and language isn't part of the world, but it's a picture of the world that, if we understand it, restricts our understanding, a clear understanding of the world. Whew. Wittgenstein is like Plato in the sense that he's at first, very difficult to understand. And I apologize for saying this again, like I did about Plato. You really just can't escape from reading Plato, which is remember, Plato never said, this is what my theories are. This is my doctrines. He never said that. He had discussions. And Wittgenstein is very similar in that way. He demonstrates how he thinks you should think rather than telling you what is true. Although he has a didactic style in the Tractatus. So you it's an acquired taste, is another way of putting it. You kind of have to digest it and read it before you get on board with what he's saying. That's why it's so difficult with Plato and Wittgenstein to describe what they're really up to. You kind of have to just get used to how they do things. And then it seems revelatory to you, I think. Not revelatory in that you see God. It's more like revelatory in that things become clarified to you. So far, so good. Anybody have any remarks so far or questions? Otis.
Yeah. When we talk about language, are we only talking about verbal language, or what about music? What about art? Other forms of language which are nonverbal, but yes, yet express reality.
Yeah, no, those are not part of the uh what he says is the world is everything that is the case. Those are things beyond language that cannot be properly captured in language and therefore can't be mapped out by this kind of picture theory of language.
Okay.
So no, but listen, it it's important not to over stress over. Let me see. That he doesn't mean to dismiss music. He doesn't mean to dismiss ethics or anything like that. He just says they're not part of what you can say is true. That's all. And this is the vibe of the whole be in a circle thing. They're not trying to eliminate. Yeah, they're quite aware you can't live your life without appreciating music and believing in things that you can't prove. They're quite aware of that. They're not that naive. But what they're saying is, let's be humble about what we can say we know. And they're basically they're very influential, very influenced and very influential in science, because they look at science and they say, what do these guys do? What they do is they have, like in chemistry, we have specific formulas for specific elements, and we know what they are, and we can say mechanically how they relate to other elements. So that and physics and chemistry are like hard science, and they're looking at that as a paradigm of what knowledge is. And when we get into basic human civilization and human interaction, we're not using that kind of reason. And what they're saying is, let's limit ourselves to saying what we know. Let's not be like Hegel. Let's say, okay, let's pull in our horns a bit and say, well, what can we really say that is true? And the program Wittgenstein lays out is the one that they found very convincing. Uh, any other remarks before I move on to the investigations? So yeah, a long period of time passed, and Wittgenstein did some lecturing, and the result is the blue and brown books. If you actually want to read anything by Wittgenstein and think that you might enjoy getting a little deeper into it, I would recommend the blue and brown books, which are much more accessible than than that passage about the broom I read from the investigations. but not all the investigations are that bad. Uh, but I just picked a particularly silly one. But it's, he's making a point there. It's not that silly in the context of what he's saying. All right. If no questions on that, I'm going to move on to the philosophical investigations. This was not published in his lifetime. Um, and I have a quote. Let me see. Somewhere I have a quote here from Feynman. And Feynman says something remarkably similar to what these guys in the linguistic philosophers were trying to achieve. This is Richard Feynman, a physicist. Is Gerald with us today? Let's see. I don't have my screen up right yet. Gerald around? He's our resident physicist. Anyway, okay, no Gerald, but this is Feynman, not a philosopher, but Feynman. The real problem in speech is not precise language. The problem is clear language. The desire to have the idea clearly communicated to the other person. It is only necessary to be precise when there is some doubt as to the meaning of a phrase, and then the precision should be put in place where the doubt exists. It is really quite impossible to say anything with absolute precision unless that thing is so abstracted from the real world as to not represent any real thing. This is Feynman, a physicist, talking, and so he's kind of aware of these same problems that Wittgenstein and these guys are attacking with uh, communication. So, all right, the philosophical investigations, some the 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 philosophical investigations do not have the rigid kind of structure of the Tractatus. Um, it's more like they are numbered, but they're not necessarily related to one another linearly. Sometimes he just goes off on a different subject. It's more like he's talking to himself. It takes kind of the form of an internal dialogue, uh, and in doing so, he rejects the Tractatus. He talks about this was the position of the author of the Tractatus, speaking of himself in third person, and uh, I think he considers the treatment of language in the Tractatus as one among many language games. So the first thing we're going to run across here is the idea of language games. Language games is an essential part of the philosophical investigation. And if we want to understand what language is doing, he thinks that the author, as he refers to him, the author of the Tractatus is a bit naive, and he has a very narrow view of what language accomplishes, because obviously the only thing that Tractatus discusses is propositions. This is this. This is this. But language does a million other things. And in fact, he finds and displays how very infinitely weird and vague language is. And it's very interesting stuff. So, a language game is a form of life. That's one way he puts it. And this is a way I deal with a lot of things that were formerly puzzling. And this is why I say if you grok what he's saying here, it can be very useful in dismissing a whole line of thought. For example, I don't know if any of you knew Tom Drew at Pomona, but Tom Drew went to the divinity school. I knew him in divinity school. And Tom Drew and I think I mentioned this conversation. He's a devout Christian and uh, but very erudite. And I was talking to him one time, just like the young priest, a young minister is talking to the older minister with Kierkegaard. I was saying, there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't make any sense to me. Uh, And he says, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, there's things that do make sense to me. Like, for instance, thank God you're okay. I know what that means. And like, let's just pray your son is going to live. I know what that means. It means more or less hope. And he says, well, you know all you need to know then. That was his response. No more theology is required than that. And that's kind of what he was saying. Now, if you take that view in other words, what that is those two statements are within a language game of the faithful community, as you might say. Thank God you're okay. Well, it's just a saying to me, but within the religious community, it has more resonance. It has more baggage attached to it. Or I pray that you'll be okay. Same thing. But it's not like it's nonsense. That's what Wittgenstein wants to say in the Tractatus. It's not like we're not communicating anything to one another. So if you take the view, like suppose I had an argument with a friend who believes everything is conscious. It's all like almost like a genus kind of point of view. Everything is conscious. The whole universe is conscious. How about rocks? They're conscious. There's an energy. Everything is conscious. And so I said to him, well, suppose my wife collapses and I call 911 and the operator says, okay, is she conscious? And I say, well, of course, everything is conscious. Rocks are conscious. The universe is conscious. What, of course. What are you asking me, you idiot? Obviously, we're playing two different language games. She's not asking my my metaphysical ideas about the universe. So what's happening there? Wittgenstein wants to say that within the context of those language games, both of those things make sense. In other words, if I say the whole universe is conscious, okay, I'm saying something kind of Deepak Chopra-ish spiritual. If I try to determine whether somebody is conscious by saying, well, of course they're conscious. Even if they were dead, they'd be conscious. That's not the same language game that the EMTs want to know about. So Wittgenstein says that what we've done in the Tractatus and in many parts of philosophy is we've mistaken one game for another game, and we've tried to apply the rules of one game to another context. For example, if you take say you take chess men, but you use them, they're 16 chess uh, players. What do you call them? Figures, and there's only 12 checkers. But suppose you use the chessmen for a game of checkers. Well, okay, you're using the same things, but they don't have the same function or the same meaning. But you could do it. You could say, okay, this guy moves like a checkers piece rather than a chess piece. Forget the fact that he's a king or a queen or anything like that. He's just going to move like a checkers piece. You could do that, but when you do that in language, it just confuses you. And the phrase that Wittgenstein uses is language goes on a holiday. It's not anchored to any human activity. And to understand the human activity, you have to understand the game that's being played and the form of life um, that is language has a utilitarian function, and language is embedded in social practices. So the meaning of any of our terms is in the particular use in that context. And to try to abstract all of language from its context, you're going to get into trouble. Okay, so one of the fundamental ideas of Wittgenstein is the language game. I think that is a very useful tool. And it's not just useful, it also can avoid a lot of nastiness. In and you know, if somebody says, "Well, thank God your son is okay," and I say, God doesn't exist. Um, I don't need to say that. I understand what he means. I'm just being obnoxious. I understand that he's expressing his sympathy and his hope that everything will work out. I don't have to go into a theological debate about whether God exists or not. Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God uh, are not valid. I don't need to do that. And so if you can understand that a different language game is being played, then you can avoid a lot of unpleasant misunderstandings. Um, the old way of looking at this was, okay, is the Platonic way, and Wittgenstein has a strange relationship to Plato. There's one point at which he says, "What is the point of all these dialogues? They don't lead any place, and they're not very well argued. And what is the point of all this?" But in other places, he talks about the Theaetetus, and he says, this is the same thing I talk about. So he does realize that Plato is making the same kinds of uh, inquiries that he is. However, the Platonic idea is if you take a word like courage, it has a real meaning and it's part of the forms, and the forms exist. And we want to determine what the real meaning of courage is. And that's the subject of one of Plato's dialogues. And to say that there is no real meaning to it is prior to Wittgenstein thought of as relativism. And if you remember going back to the Greeks, the Protagoras was a relativist. He's the guy that says, has the guys put their hands in the cold water and the hot water, and then there's a medium temperature bowl in the middle. And one of them says it's cold, the other one says it's hot, and Protagoras says, "See, everything is relative to your own experience." And so that was the opposing view until Wittgenstein, as far as I know, that was the opposing view to Platonism, that either there are real meanings to things or nothing means anything and everything is up for grabs. And that led to deconstructionism in the 20th century, that whatever meaning is, it's just whatever's controlled by the ruling classes. And that comes from Marx. So uh, until Wittgenstein, I think that was the main idea, that you either have Platonism or you have relativism. But Wittgenstein finds another path in there, which is language games. So it's not true that when somebody is speaking about God, um, and you don't believe in God, that you guys both have an opinion and those opinions are just different and there's no way of resolving it. Wittgenstein this says this is kind of a rigid and uninformed and unobservant description of what language does. He'd rather say, okay, I understand what you're saying. It's not like you're saying nothing. It's not like I have a strongly different opinion from you. I understand what you're saying if you say God bless me, or if you say uh, thank God you're okay. I understand what it is that you're saying. So it's obnoxious to basically obnoxious to say, well, I don't believe in God, as if you have a different opinion of what that statement, the import of that statement means. Yes, you do have a different opinion, but insofar as that exchange is concerned between you and the religious person, you being an atheist and the religious person, in that context of that language game that's being played right now, where he's showing concern for you, you understand what he's saying, and it's kind of rude to say you don't, to say that you're saying you're talking nonsense to me. So in that way, the Wittgensteinian approach of language games, I think, is very useful in not only solving philosophical problems, and there are several philosophical problems that I think are well addressed by this, but also in social problems or interactions with other people. Uh, so just a couple more points here on the investigations. Another really, I'm not sure I'm going to get all this done today, but anyway, another really central uh, and kind of counterintuitive uh, Wittgensteinian point is that there is no such thing as a private language. Now, what he's referring to is when you say things like, "Well, I had this feeling once before," or deja vu would be a good example of it. Uh, he's saying that all language is public. All language has a public meaning. And if it didn't, it wouldn't communicate anything. So thinking that when you're saying something, you're expressing something that's only apparent to you, only visible in your mind. Because we typically think this. We think, well, I have this feeling I'm trying to express to you right now. And uh, if it's truly not possible to express it, then we wouldn't have words for it. But we do have words for things like uh, being depressed. Like I'm really depressed. Well, that's funny. If I heard from, uh, let's say that. Well, here's a good example. Robin Williams apparently was terribly depressed, but boy, he didn't come across that way. Now, if you knew Robin Williams and he always acted, as far as I could tell, he always acted like that. I actually see, he used to hang out in front of the, what was the name of that comedy club in San Francisco? It was right next to the Last Day Saloon. I'd play there and you'd see Robin Williams hanging out front. And he was always the Robin Williams that you saw on TV. He was very friendly and very outgoing and all that. And if you were to find out he was depressed, now I think he was depressed later. I don't think he was depressed then. But anyway, if he were to describe himself as depressed, you'd say, boy, I've never seen anybody that looked less like they were depressed than you are. Depressed people can't get out of bed. They can't do anything. Life doesn't mean anything to them anymore. They can't motivate themselves to do anything. You're about as far away from that as I can imagine. So what you're saying is that he's expressing something that seems to be an internal state, and you're saying it conflicts with my idea of what a person who's depressed uh, acts like. In other words, he's saying something that usually has public uh, manifestations. That if I'm depressed, I look sad. You know, I complain all the time. I know friends. I have friends that are depressed, and they'll tell you right off the bat they're depressed. Well, you never hear that from Robin Williams. So in other words, Wittgenstein says saying that there's a state inside your mind that nobody has access to, but you're going to call it something. Let's say you're going to call it alpha. I have this feeling alpha. And I had it yesterday. And so Wittgenstein says, "Well, how do you know you had it yesterday? What's the test that you had that same feeling yesterday? Because if it's not public, it's like color blindness. We have a test for color blindness. It's not just something that you experience. Even though we can't see how you experience color, we can give you a test that shows that there are some colors you're not seeing. And so you're experiencing color differently, but our definition of it has to do with a public test that we can all view, and your performance on that is public. So Wittgenstein, it's another one of his famous doctrines. No such thing as a private language. There's no such thing as expressing things that are only your personal experience. Because if they were, the words wouldn't mean anything to anybody else. So words have a public meaning. That's another way of saying the same thing. Uh, Words always have a public meaning. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I think I can get through this real quickly. Another Wittgensteinian uh, familiar Wittgensteinian phrase is family resemblance. And so this is his response to what we call Platonism, or essentialism is another term that's used in philosophy for Platonism. So if we're going to talk about using courage once again, if we're going to talk about courage, Plato's idea and Socrates' idea is there's something essential that could be figured out that is courage. And Wittgenstein's approach is no, courage is used in a variety of contexts, and sometimes it's not exactly the same meaning, but yet we know what it means. So he says the uses of the word have family resemblances. That's the phrase he uses. There's a family resemblance between my using courage in one place and another place. There's not one definition that is rigid and never varies. There's just a family resemblance. And it's close enough so that we recognize what it is in every case, even though it doesn't mean exactly the same thing in every case. And if you were limited to limit your use of the word, any word, to a specific definition, you'd find that it would restrict your use of that word because um, language is very metaphorical. We're always using stuff, making up ways. In fact, Anne's a poet. I'm sure she does this all the time. She's using a word in a different way than we do in, say, normal conversation or scientific descriptions. But it still communicates something. So it has a family resemblance to the same word being used in a chemistry experiment or something. It's the same word, but just like the chess men being used in the checkers game, it has a different function. There are different rules that circumscribe its use, even though they're similar. They have a family resemblance. Very.
So my question would be, it seems if you, I understand that language, there's an ambiguity inherent in language or an imprecision inherent in language. But if you try to probe that and you try to figure out what is the actual meaning of a word, what other tool do you have but another word? And so doesn't that become a circular problem that you never can resolve?
No, you don't have to resolve it because in the context defines what the words mean. We're not usually the whole thing that I told you about Wittgenstein and the broom. We don't okay, here's another example. If I say stand over there and I point to a place on the floor, you don't say, well, do you want me above or beneath the surface of the earth? Or do you want me halfway to Mars? Exactly where do you want me to stand? The pointing is just shows me a direction. It doesn't give me exact XYZ coordinates. That's ridiculous. I mean, I'd be saying, come on, man, are you insane? Say stand over there is perfectly adequate. And so Wittgenstein wants to say you don't need to go further than that in human context. And when you do, when you try to go further than that, you're going to have language go on a holiday, and you're going to require of language more than it was ever designed to accomplish. Peter.
I'm very interested in what you said about Wittgenstein. I'm familiar with a little bit of it, but I have read very little by him. But I want to go back to the Vienna Circle for a moment, because I think Wittgenstein is modest in saying language communicates all sorts of things that can't be rationally or empirically proved. But as I understand the Vienna Circle, I haven't read them. I've only read A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, which may be a vulgarization of them.
Oh, he's
They're
good.
basically saying, they're basically saying that only scientific language really means anything. And if they want to explore the logic of science, that's fine with me, even though I can't follow. But to say that, any statement that has to do with religion, ethics, poetry, or art can only be an emotional preference or an expression of will and can't have meaning. That seems to me the reverse of modest. It seems to me a kind of hubris that Wittgenstein is not guilty of, and most scientists aren't guilty of it either. But it seems like an attempt to eliminate really from a meaningful position all kinds of discourse that they can't use. And I know this is a direct quotation from Rudolf Carnap. Philosophy is to be replaced by the logic of science. I have no problem with saying philosophy ought to explore, among other things, the logic of science. But this is an attempt really to destroy the ground under which any philosophy, however empirical or skeptical or flexible, stands. And sure, it's uncertain ground. It's not a permanent foundation. I think that's been one of the themes of the course. But you can still say things. And I know that P.F. Strawson said of Wittgenstein that he had a prejudice against the inner. I'm not sure that's true, but I think it really is true of Carnap, Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, that school of philosophy.
Okay, they use the word nonsense,
Yeah,
but this goes back to Hume. Hume also said that if you can't, he had his two criteria were matters of fact and relations of ideas, and if you can't justify what you're saying by one of those two things, then he says cast it into the flames, which is also pretty strong. And
yeah,
the logical positivists or the Vienna Circle, they're going to use words like nonsense. But I read them, and I think it's fair to read them as, I mean, these people had families and lives and so forth, and
yeah,
you can't say you love your daughter and have to spend 2 hours analyzing whether love is something that can be empirically substantiated or not. So they had to live their lives. And I really think they are trying to limit what philosophy says it knows. And it is this response against the Hegelian, avalanche of words that are not defined. I think it's like a reaction against that. If you can even use Hegel and say, okay, one extreme is Hegel, it's a moment in the dialectic, and they're pulling it back to the other extreme and saying, no, we can't say anything that we're not clear about. And they do use terms like that, Peter. They do say you can't, you don't, this is not, you can't say this. It's just nonsense. But nobody, by the way, in these guys have attacked things like ethics and without very impressive results. And what they end up saying, because what they say is, okay, let's look at the use of ethical terms, right? Just like Wittgenstein says, we're going to, okay, how is this term used? And they have a hard time figuring out how it's used because uh, one theory of the logical positivists or the linguistic analysts about ethics is what you're doing is recommending that somebody act a certain way. That it's always kind of a recommendation. You should act this way. Well, that's not very satisfying, I must say, in terms of an ethical position. I'm recommending that listen to Led Zeppelin. I'm recommending that you don't lie. It's not a very strong position. So they didn't get very far in ethics, and they kind of abandoned it. In fact, Wittgenstein himself says ethics and aesthetics are one and the same, which means it's just a matter of taste. And I think that's pretty strong. And I think people like yourself, Peter, I think we look for something more in say ethical discussions than just that, just kind of throwing up your hands.
yeah,
However, I think that said, I think they're making a legitimate point that you have to be cognizant, just going back to Socrates is no different about what the limits of your ability to substantiate anything you're saying, what those limits are.
yeah,
I I, I think that's fair, and Wittgenstein says whatever we can't speak of, we have to remain silent. I think that's kind of strong, but he clearly had a mystical side to him. And he just said, just like the Tao Te Ching says, Whatever can be spoken of is not the true way. That's the Tao Te Ching. What the true way is,
Does
it
not
cannot be
know.
spoken of.
Yeah.
So that's the mystical part of Wittgenstein. Yeah, Barry.
Well, it seems to me if you're if you're trying to, someone's trying to juxtapose the way science uses language or prop language and you versus non-science, yours it seems like in the world of science, there's this precision because it's a completely closed system that defines its own terms in a very specific way and then builds a system of logic around those definitions. And that's great. But if you expect that same level of precision and immutable truth to emerge from non-science, then you're never going to get there. And language is an imperfect tool to do it, but it doesn't mean that the discussions you have with this imperfect tool are not valuable and important.
I don't think Wittgenstein would disagree with that. They, like I say, they're human beings. Wittgenstein does have opinions about things in the real world, uh, and he can he doesn't prohibit himself from speaking about them. Uh, the thing they're trying to call attention to, which I think is valuable, is how little we can say we know for sure. That's
Yeah.
I think that's legit, and in the logical positivists had something called the verification principle. So whatever you said, you had to be able to specify the mode of verification. Like, how could this be verified? I think that's a good question to ask yourself. If you're saying something, now, can I actually verify? Is there a way I can demonstrate that what I'm saying is true? I think that's a humbling and good thing to ask yourself. And if not, then you rely on feelings. And I'm not going to give up my feeling that racism is, well, actually, that could be justified by Kant, but let me think of something else. Um, well, I could just say, well, I don't have to abide by Kant. If I think that racism is immoral or unethical, and Kant says, well, if you don't treat everybody the same and you don't have them abide by the same laws, then you can't say you're ethical. And what if I just say, yes, I can? What's ethical is what serves, like Thrasymachus in the Republic. What serves the strong is what is ethical, uh, which is not the same as Kant. I just have a different idea of ethics. So I think it's of some value to understand where the limits of your and Kant would admit that. Kant would say, okay, then you don't have an ethical system as far as my definition is concerned. I don't think Kant could say more than that. Not very satisfying, I understand. Peter, yeah.
There's a remark in Shaw's play Major Barbara. Undershaft, the munitions manufacturer, who is sort of a devil's advocate, says there is only one true morality for every man, but every man has not the same true morality. And somebody says, I don't know what you're talking about. And another character translates it into one man's meat is another man's poison. But the interesting thing to me there is one true morality for every man. You may not know beforehand what it is, but whatever your moral, vision is, it's more than an attitude. That is yours, and you should abide by it, and something will happen to you if you don't abide by it. But it may not be the same as mine or hers or his. It's not a perfect solution, but I think it has something to it.
Well, that would be called relativism, and it would be something that the existentialist would agree with. I think Hemingway said that uh, morality is something I feel good afterwards. I don't think he
Right.
used the
Right.
word morality. I don't know the exact quote, but
No, it's in The Sun Also Rises. What's moral
is what,
What is immoral is what you feel bad afterwards
right. And
about.
so that doesn't help a lot when you're not doing it, when you haven't done it yet. But then that is consistent with the idea of existentialists that existence precedes essence, that you don't know who you are until you live your life. And you don't, it's not waiting out there for you. It's something that you determine in every choice you make. Uh, okay, well, I don't think that went as badly as I thought it would. But the reason that Wittgenstein is lands so heavy is because if you really have followed everything along in the semester, and if these questions raised by Plato, I want to say one more thing. Anyway, if these questions raised by Plato and Kant and Hume have any weight for you, I think that Wittgenstein will alleviate some of the weight. I'm not saying all of it, but I think that he will help you out of some confusion. His famous phrase is the goal of philosophy is to lead the fly out of the fly bottle, where the idea is you can see the outside, but you're being trapped by your own idea. Your own ideas are imprisoning you, and you want to escape from your own preconceptions and be free to view the world in a wider way. I think that's a. I wanted to say one thing about Wittgenstein that to me, he did write a book on, I think it's called Remarks on the Foundations of Arithmetic, which is pretty weird. And he tries to, this is really contrary to Plato, and I don't think it's successful, but he tries to make the point that uh, mathematics is just utilitarian. Now, we invent mathematics to solve particular problems, to do particular puzzles, but there's no reason why, for example, there's no reason why the numbers have to all be the same distance from one another. Uh, which is pretty weird thing to say. And I'd want to say that I think he's wrong about this. I think there is a reason, and I don't know what it is, but this goes back to Meno's paradox. Like Meno seems to know stuff that seems to be embedded in the universe, and that's the same thing Einstein thought. Einstein thought it's very puzzling that what I can think of in my brain seems to have uh, a door, a window to understand things that are physical out there in the real world. Einstein thought that was very deeply mysterious, and I think Plato did too. And I don't think you could cast a wand like Wittgenstein does and say, I'm just going to do away with that by saying mathematics is all utilitarian. I don't think you could do that, but I'm in deep water here. And so if you, I've recommended many times you go to Wikipedia and read the page on the philosophy of mathematics, and you'll see that this, this, to say the least, has not been resolved. What mathematics is and why we know anything about it has not been resolved, and that's a problem that goes all the way back to Meno. Okay, my goodness. Yeah, I didn't think I'd be able to get through that. But anyway, next time, this is about it, guys. And so next time, I plan to just do a kind of review of the semester, I would say, if this were a semester. And that'll be it.
So what are we going to do next for a class?
I have no idea. I know everything I need to know, so I don't need any more classes.
Well, speaking as a cognitive science researcher, I think it's good for us to learn something that's different and challenges our minds.
Nothing pleases me more, really,
I
than
think you
So
should
much
do.
fun. This has been so much
I
fun.
think Laurel should teach the next
Yeah.
class.
yeah. There
That
you
would
go,
definitely
Laurel.
be
I was
something I
thinking,
didn't know about.
Anne could practice and Peter could practice teaching literature, poetry. I don't know, or we could get some legal teaching about the Constitution or something, or law stuff, or who knows, epidemiology. I don't know. How do you do science?
I thought that, yeah, we could at least get people to talk about them a little bit about themselves and maybe, yeah, we have a lot of smarts here in this room.
Right.
I would not put myself in that category, but
Oh, come
um,
on.
Hey,
No,
come on.
no, but
I would,
there's a lot here in
I would be
experiences. So
interested
I
in
think,
just, I'd be interested in just a short thing of what cool things you've learned through your work or something, or what that people might not know. I'd be really interested. That's a great idea. Listen, I got to run because I have to.
yeah.
All
I'm in
right.
the
We'll
process of
see you
trying.
next time, and we'll try to wrap things up and then maybe make some kind of plan for the future.
Hey, awesome. Have fun,
Yeah.
folks. Stay cool.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right, guys.
All right. See ya.
Thanks.